Today's lecture is about going for topicality against planless affirmatives. So we're going to be talking about how to go for framework against the set of affirmatives that are not defending an instrumental action in the direction of the resolution. And these debates are quite unique and a little bit different from some of the traditional T debates that we have. But I think that there is a lot of nuance and there are ways to really practice the skill to really get good at it, which will increase your win rate drastically. I want to emphasize that throughout this lecture, I want this to be as interactive as possible. So please raise your hands, pop in with any questions that you have. One of the goals of this lecture is to try to be as responsive as possible to the set of arguments that you are debating, and not tell you about the set of arguments that I debated 10 years ago. And so I'm trying to be as responsive to and reactive to the trends in the way that these debates have gone down recently. And so please do raise your hand, prompt me with questions about arguments you've debated or things that you might be confused about so I can address those things. A few goals that I have for this talk. So one, I want to give a bit of a theoretical frame for thinking through topicality against planless apps that will hopefully drive both the way that we explain our offense in future debates, as well as the way that we will end up answering common affirmative arguments against topicality. And the other part about this is that I want to stress the importance of writing your own T-blocks. From coaching debate for a long time, it has been a truism that the set of debaters on the team that write the blocks tend to win far more debates than the set of debaters who read the blocks that someone else on the team wrote. Especially in a debate about topicality, where so much of who wins and who loses is based on who does a better job of explaining and drawing out the nuances of these positions for the judge. Your capacity and ability to talk about these things in your own words, in your own language, to understand exactly what it is that you're saying in both the 2 and C and the 2 and R is so important. So I will emphasize not just that you need to write your own T-blocks, that you need to give practice speeches in front of coaches, you need to get feedback on those blocks, you need to constantly be adjusting those to whatever is happening in previous debates in order to fix whatever flaws you might be or to emphasize particular points of feedback that you get from judges. So to sort of start out with, in terms of the theoretical frame for how I think about this argument, I want to emphasize that when I think about going for topicality against planless affirmatives and going for T-USFG, I think about it fundamentally understanding that the argument that you're going for is topicality. It is not that different from the lowercase t topicality arguments that we might go for against policy affirmatives. I say this not to emphasize a semantic distinction between topicality and framework, but simply to say that I think that the way and the lens through which I understand and evaluate some of these arguments has a lot to do with the way that I understand and evaluate and was taught topicality. So let's start there. What happens in a topicality debate? Well, in a topicality debate, both sides proffer an interpretation of the topic. Okay? Both sides proffer an interpretation for what the affirmative needs to do to meet its burden of proof and to win the debate. And then at the end of the debate, the judge votes for which of those interpretations is best for debate. And everything that we say, from standards to limits to precision to education and fairness to reasonability versus competing interpretations, all of those words are different frames and lenses to answer the question of which of these interpretations is best for debate. The exact same thing happens in a T-USFG debate, okay? even in a world where the affirmative is not reading a lot of definition evidence, they are still proffering an interpretation for debate and providing a set of arguments for why their interpretation is best for debate. So the same thing that the judge does in any topicality debate, they do at the end of a debate about T-USFG, which is to decide which interpretation is best for debate. So everything we say, limits, everything we say about whether it's our case list, whether it's about the TVA, switch side debate, whatnot, all of these are lenses and frames to answer the ultimate question of which interpretation is best for debate. And so I want to jump into one topicality trend that I have observed become much more common, certainly at the college level, and I've also observed this trend at the high school level, which is an affirmative argument that says, so this is, affirmative teams answering T-USFG, and I will see these teams make an argument that says either one, topicality is prescriptively not a debate about models of debate, or two, they will say that it is normatively ought not be about models of debate. And what those teams mean by this argument is that the judge should end the debate with a decision about what happened in this round and not about what should happen in other rounds or what ought to be the model of debate, because it is impossible for any decision maker to universalize a model of debate. So these teams proffer the claim that, okay, when a negative team wins a debate on framework, does that deter future teams from reading critical affirmatives in 2025? No, they're going to show up around, if they lose round 3 on framework, they're going to show up round 5 and probably still read their planless affirmative, and vice versa, right? If a negative team loses a debate on framework, they're still going to show up, their next negative debate, and they're going to go for T. And so we have a mixed model debate where some teams are going to instrumentally defend the resolution, some teams are not going to instrumentally defend the resolution, and there's nothing that we can do to change about this. Have any of you all encountered this particular argument? So some nods, some shakes, but this is an argument that I've seen more and more common at the college level. And so I have a few thoughts about this argument. One, I think that it is simply descriptively wrong in terms of describing what a topicality debate is about. So topicality debates are not about trying to provide, solvency for the harm. So the job that, we are taking up is not to say, look, we're going to talk every team not talking about the topic down from talking about the topic. That's not at all what's happening when someone reads topicality. Topicality is a normative argument, right, that an interpretation of debate where the affirmative defends the United States federal government exploring and or developing the Arctic is a normatively good model of debate. And when the judge votes for that argument, they are endorsing that model of debate normatively. And so that is why topicality must be a debate about models of debate. And from an educational perspective, it should be and ought to be a debate about models of debate, because that provides us an educational and pedagogical lens to have a discussion about what models of debate are good or bad, right? If we don't do that, then we never can have those discussions about, debates about debate, how should we orient debate. We can never have those discussions if we don't talk about it from the context of what is the model being endorsed. My second pushback against this is that all debates, right, are models in some way, shape, or form, okay? So if an affirmative interpretation, or if an affirmative team says that topicality should not be about models of debate, it should just be about what happened in this debate, and topicality was a microaggression that means that you should lose, well, that is presenting a model of debate, presenting a model of decision making. Second, I find this argument to have circular reasoning. What I mean by this is that the premise begets the conclusion. So if you say that the judge ought not vote for topicality because it's not going to persuade other judges to vote on topicality, then no one ever votes on topicality, right? So it becomes a bit of a dog eating its own tail. So framework is fundamentally about a comparison for what debate should look like under competing visions of debate. So let's think a little bit broadly about the mechanics of a T-USFG argument. What does it look like? Well, one, it should have an interpretation, right? You should have an interpretation that says that the affirmative should defend the instrumental implementation of the United States federal government, increasing its exploration and or development of the Arctic. And you should define the key terms of the resolution. What are the key terms of the resolution? Well, one, the agent. You should define the United States federal government, or if the resolution says the United States, you should define the United States. You should probably define what development and exploration means. Right, what is the action of the resolution? And then I think it's often helpful to define the object of the resolution, the Arctic. What geographic area is the resolution asking the affirmative to act? And so we've got an interpretation, we've got definitions of the key terms in the resolution, and this is providing us a lens through which to say, here is the predictable limit that we have set on the topic. So we have done some research about what the topic means. We've cut some cards about what we think a predictable burden is for the affirmative. And we're saying that this is what the affirmative should do to win the debate. You need a clear violation. I know oftentimes this might seem entirely obvious, but the 1 and C, I think, should still articulate why it is that the affirmative has violated the interpretation, the definitions that you have read in the 1 and C. And then you should have some standards. You should have some impacts and some arguments about why your interpretation is good for debate. And so there are two common, impact arguments about topicality, and we can spend a fair amount of time talking through some of these things. But first, there is an impact about competitive equity, okay? So this is the fairness argument. This is the argument that in debate, debate being a game, we generally want to design games in a way that there is some balance of competitive equity between the two sides and the opponents playing that game, okay? So we generally want the AF to win some debates and the neg to win some debates. If you went to a tournament and the AF won every debate and everyone went 3-3, that tournament would not be super fun, right? And so this argument says that an interpretation of debate that allows the affirmative side to make arguments that are not in defense of the resolution would unbalance competitive equity, okay? It would make debate too hard for the negative side in a way that would make debate less fair and would ultimately degrade the game a little bit, right? So that's the fairness argument. Second argument is about the educational value of proffering predictable limits, okay? And this is the argument that we often call clash. And so this argument says that in a lens of the topic, where we have a predictable limit on the set of arguments that the affirmative can advocate, then we create better research incentives, okay? If you know, right, like just take camp as an example as being a little bit different from the way that debates play out in real life, but it's like, okay, there's, I don't know, approximately 10 AFs, right, between your opponent's labs, and you're doing what about that? Writing case negs to all of them, hopefully, right? And so in a world where there is a predictable limit and boundary on the content of affirmative arguments, it creates an incentive for negative teams to go deeper into researching specific strategies for those arguments. This produces debates that are in-depth and produces incentives for subsequent argumentative refinement. What do I mean by this? I mean that when affirmative teams encounter these specific case negs, again, we can use the lens of what we're doing here to think about this, right? We're going to have the interlab debates. You're going to debate the case negatives that have been prepared by another lab. And after the interlab debates, you're going to go, oh my God, I need to cut some new answers to these arguments, right? We need better answers to, the Russia DA. We need better answers to the China DA, whatever it is. And so you're going to refine your answers to those arguments, and the other side is going to cut answers to those answers. And so when we have debates within a limited set of content boundaries, we end up with this process of iterative argumentative refinement, which again produces some greater educational value in debate. And so that's what we mean by clash. The internal link to all of these things is predictable limits. So limits that there is some content boundary on the number of affirmative cases you're going to debate. Predictability in the sense that we know what these words in the resolution mean, and we can reasonably prepare before the tournament about what those arguments are. And so oftentimes when teams that I've coached will tell me that they are having trouble articulating impacts to framework, sometimes the corrective for that is to get better at articulating their internal link to those impacts. So the easier it is that you can explain why your interpretation is best for predictable limits, why their interpretation unravels both predictability and limits, if you can provide case lists of different categories of arguments that would be allowed under their interpretation, the more debating you do on that, the easier it is for the judge to decide at the end of the debate that your interpretation is better for debate than their interpretation. The more concrete it is for the judge to assess that their interpretation is unfair or worse for clash. Okay, so the more internal link work you do about limits, the easier it is to explain why ideas like fairness and clash have substantive and large, quote-unquote, terminal impacts. So let's talk a little bit about these terminal impact questions. So oftentimes, when I was having these debates, one of the larger controversies was whether fairness was an independent impact in and of itself, or whether the value structure of procedural fairness was simply an internal link to the educational values of debate. In my mind, fairness is an independent terminal impact itself. Why is this? Well, procedural fairness, we designed the game of debate with a lot of different design elements. For example, right, we create set speech times for all of the speeches. We've created the speech structure where the affirmative speaks first and last, and the negative team gets to speak twice in a row in the middle of the debate. We have done all of those things for some reasons, right? Because we are trying to create a game that is both fun and balanced from a competitive equity standpoint. And so the value of procedural fairness is about the value of debate in and of itself. If debate is valuable, the game of debate is valuable, then it is valuable for that game to be fair. Fairness, rather than being an internal link to clash-based arguments, is actually one of the terminal impacts to a set of predictable limits that produce the most clash. Questions about fairness? I know this is sort of like a hot topic, so I want to take a pause there. Ethan.
Can you explain your last line again about like how it preserves the game?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in debate, we create a set of norms for how debate should operate. The speech times and the speech orders, prep time, right? All of these are norms that have developed. One of the norms that is part of this that we think is good to preserve is the norm that the affirmative should fulfill its burden to prove the resolutional statement true. This is important for preserving competitive equity between both sides. If debates were procedurally unfair, it would not be a game that people think is worthwhile to invest in.
In the context of fairness, sometimes like AF teams make the argument that there's a distinction between structural fairness and procedural fairness, and that we ought to do one over the other.
Yeah.
When going for framework, like how would you resolve that, or like where would you go from there?
Absolutely, it's a great question. So the question is, affirmative teams in response to fairness arguments will say that there's a difference between structural fairness and procedural fairness, and will probably make the argument that the judge should prioritize arguments about structural fairness. So an affirmative, might posit the argument that minority debaters are in a sort of structurally underprivileged position in debate, and that judges should try to correct for those structural fairness barriers rather than questions of procedural fairness. So the way that you answer this is about proximity to the ballot, okay? So voting for a team does not correct the structural fairness barriers in debate. And there certainly are, resource, class-based barriers to making debate as accessible or as fair as it can be for all people, but judges do not have a corrective or a remedy to that. But the judge in a T-debate has a very clear remedy to the way that the affirmative has been unfair, both in this debate and the way that their interpretation might be unfair for debate. And that remedy is to vote for our interpretation, which is more fair. So the judge has a remedy to procedural fairness by voting negative and voting for our interpretation. The judge does not have a very clear or apparent remedy to structural fairness in debate. And so that's the way that you sort of disaggregate those things. It's proximity to the ballot. How can the judge fix or solve those problems? Yeah.
Two questions. One, I think like a lot of, at least for me, like the T framework debating is I'll understand like a lot of different components about how arguments attract, but I guess like I don't know how to string them together in a coherent speech. How would you recommend like organizing the 2&R going for T framework? Obviously it's dependent on each debate, but like general organization skills or like tactics. And then the second question is a more specific one. Where people are like reading like framework is microaggression, or it's like an extension of policing. So dealing with that / there's like offense that you think.
Yeah, two good questions. So the first question, how do we organize the 2&R? How do we structure the 2&R when we're going for T-USFG? And so the biggest part about this is you want to make sure when you're writing out blocks, and especially when you're thinking about how the 2&R operates, is you want to make sure that your speeches are as reactive to the set of things that the affirmative has said as possible. So you never want to find yourself in a situation where you are giving a 2 and R against a critical affirmative that is the same as the 2 and R you gave against a different critical affirmative. Your 2 and R should sound different based on both what the affirmative is and what the affirmative strategy has looked like, and the way that they framed their arguments and their offense against topicality. From an organizational structural perspective, you of course start, I think in a T debate it is useful to start with just quick, our interpretation is that the United States, the affirmative should instrumentally defend the United States federal government, increasing its exploration and or development of the Arctic. This interpretation is best for predictable limits. Explain why it's best for predictable limits, and then do terminal impact versus their offense, right? And so it's about explaining your offense first and then providing good defensive arguments against their offense. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth, but I think that one of the biggest tasks that you have, my sort of 2 tricks of, if you're getting a lot of decisions that are like, I don't know what the terminal, I'm having trouble with your terminal impact, sometimes the corrective is getting better at explaining why fairness is valuable in and of itself, or explaining why clash is super, super valuable. But there are 2 easy correctives that are different than that. One of them I've talked about before, which is explaining your internal link. The other is doing a better job of minimizing affirmative offense, right? Yeah.
Sorry, one more thing. I think this is like probably this is specific to my school, but like for some reason we're not supposed to read fairness. Like I know a lot of people say that's the best impact. What's the best way to articulate clash in a way that's not like turns all of their offense, or is that controls their offense? Because that's kind of how we're articulating it now. I'm not exactly sure how to articulate it as an independent terminal impact.
Yeah, okay. So clash is an argument that a set of predictable limits maximizes the educational values of debate in and of itself, and produces a set of skills that make us good advocates outside of debate. And so I do think that the turns their offense argument is an important layer to this, right? So you absolutely should be forwarding the argument that if someone wanted to advocate for, or be an activist against problematic government practices, right, in the real life, that doing the game of policy debate where they're doing a lot of back and forth research, having a lot of clash, that is really, really valuable for assessing those sets of skills. And the way that I always explain this is like, you have that explanation, and then you say, look, debaters are gonna, if we're just sort of talking about what the truth is, debaters are gonna go on to be a lot of different things in life, okay? Some of you are gonna be lawyers, maybe some of you are gonna be doctors and scientists, and maybe some of you are gonna be radical activists, and maybe some of you are gonna work in the government, right? Like debaters are gonna be a whole lot of different things when they grow up and get into the real world. For any walk of life that any debater goes into, it is valuable for them to have debated topics where there's lots of clash, right? And so the way that you make it independent is you say, look, not only is it good for the set of content arguments that you're talking about, but we know in reality that debaters are going to go into all different walks of life, and it's going to be valuable for them in any of those walks of life to have the skills and have the process of clash and argumentative refinement. So it's like the 2 ways it's external is like some debaters are not going to do your thing. Those folks should still have a lot of clash. And then you have clash is important for the educational value of debate. So that argumentative refinement argument that I was talking about earlier, I think is another way to kind of explicate why clash is independently valuable relative to the process that they're talking about. The other question that we got, how do we answer the argument that topicality is a microaggression? So this is another common argument trend that I've seen that postdates my debate career largely. So the way that I think, so when I talk to judges who will vote for this argument, sometimes they will tell me, well, you know, I don't really want to vote for that argument, but I end up being put in a bit of a weird situation when the negative team does not contest the link, right? So when the negative team never says, hey, we actually did not do a microaggression here, the judge is left with, you certainly did do a microaggression, we're now assessing whether that is good or bad, or whether the ballot can remedy it, or whether that means you should vote, you know, aft versus vote nay. So my biggest piece of advice for how to answer the microaggressions argument is always contest it at the level of the link. So no, reading T-USFG is not a microaggression. Calling it a microaggression trivializes that term and makes it much harder for us to use that term to better educational spaces. Okay, microaggression means something very specific about the way that educators talk to and relate to minority students in educational spaces. And if we just call everything a microaggression, then we are not using that tool in the way that we ought to. So you say that, and then you say that you know, voting aft is a poor corrective to that argument. You know, you make that set of arguments, so you contest it both at the length and at the impact level. The second part of this is that, so there's the policing metaphor that you sometimes see often. This, again, is going to go back to the theme that I started with, which is that topicality is about interpretation and about comparing interpretations for debate. And so I don't know how many of you have interacted with the police, but you know, when you interact with the police, you are not having like a debate about interpretations, right? You know, it's kind of what they say, right? And so topicality is very, very different, because what we are doing when we read topicality is we're not saying you did a bad thing, you should be punished by the judge for doing that bad thing. We are saying, here is an interpretation for a vision of debate that we think is good and we think that the judge should endorse. The other team, the affirmative, is free to proffer a counter-interpretation for how debate should work. They're free to make arguments about why that interpretation is better than our interpretation. So when we have debate, we are having a negotiation about interpretation. That is not policing. That is very, very different from any interaction that one might have, you know, with the police or with anyone like that. Yeah.
Do you think it's like a similar response to like switch side debate in TVs, which are like, they allow us to read our offense only in like a very contextual, or only in like this context, which is still within the confines of like what they view as the like best version of debate, which means that it's like still trying to fit us and our literature into a box, but like it's supposed to solve our offense or something.
Yeah. So let's jump into that. So there are a set of arguments that I kind of layer under the hat of compatibility. And the use case of these compatibility arguments is to answer the affirmative objection that T-USFG excludes or brackets out a discussion of the literature base or the issues that the affirmative has talked about, okay? Which is a thematic affirmative argument that I see in literally every 2AC I've ever encountered a Planless team read, is they will say that your interpretation excludes discussions about our issues. And so what are you going to do about this? Well, there are sort of three ways and three arguments that I think are good and useful. So one, the topical version of the affirmative. And so the topical version of the affirmative says that there are ways to topically advocate for exploration or development of the Arctic that can also touch upon some of the issues that the affirmative is talking about. So for example, if you're debating a planless affirmative about settler colonialism and a problematic history of exploration, some of our affirmative cases about like co-production of knowledge might be topical versions of the AF in that circumstance. The most important part about topical version of the AF is I think you need to make a real life assessment about whether or not the literature base or the problem set the affirmative is talking about can actually be talked about under topical advocacy. Sometimes affirmative cases are set up to say being topical is bad, right? Sometimes the thesis claim of the 1AC will be exploration and development of the Arctic is bad. If that's the case, it's going to be hard to win that there is a topical version of the AF. So in those circumstances, the better argument is that you can read their argument as a critique of exploration or development on the neg. So, I call this read it on the neg. People are now, people now just sort of just say switch side debate, but the argument that the affirmatives literature base can be accessed by a discussion of it on the negative. And so the question I got earlier is, how do we answer the argument that topical version of the AF or switch side debate kind of puts the affirmatives discussion or literature debate, or, puts the affirmatives discussion or literature base in a box, right? It kind of forces it to happen under the narrow confines of, normative policy debate that maybe they have some external critiques of. Well, one, there is, a little bit of a narrow use case for some of these arguments, which is simply to provide defense to, it is important to talk about our content, right? Our content material. And so you're just saying, look, there is a way under our model of debate where we can access discussions of your literature base and your content that is defense to that particular piece of offense about exclusion. The second thing is that I think it is very, very useful for the negative team to describe and in a concrete and practical sense, what do the following debates look like when either there's a topical version of the AF or when you read your critical affirmative arguments as a negative critical argument. So you want to compare, actual debates. What would that look like, right? We would have great debates where the affirmative defends exploration and development against negative critique of exploration and development from a settler colonial lens. So you should always forward the argument that the debates that happen under switch side debate or the debates that happen under the topical version of the AF are good debates to have. So this is another way that you add an internal link layer to why your interpretation is best for clash and best for debate, is by talking about here's what happens in those debates. I will oftentimes see affirmative teams make an argument that says, they will say, we should have revolutionary strategies debate revolutionary strategies, right? The best way the debate can happen is if you put radical strategies in conversations with other radical strategies, and that will produce the most revolutionary education. We'll learn about strategies. We'll get to figure out what the best ones are. So I think you should do a couple things about this. One, you should disagree with the premise, and you should say that it is better to have a conversation about these strategies versus strategies that advocate for the state or for political pragmatism. So you should say that it is good to put the theory of settler colonialism in conversation with political pragmatism. That's a good conversation and a good discussion to be had that we have under our model of debate. The conversations that their model of debate encourages, where we put the theory of settler colonialism and we pit it in opposition with the theory of Afro-pessimism, right? Are those debates really producing debates where we come up with, capital T truth answers to like what the best strategy is? Well, no, because in truth, the affirmative wins all of these debates because they have the permutation. And most of those authors are advocating for the permutation. So now we get back to a bit of a side-bias argument, but Rev v. Rev debates are not good debates because the affirmative tends to win all of them because they have the permutation. State v. Rev debates are comparatively better, they're comparatively deeper, they have a better point of comparison. And so I think that that is the offensive way that we can leverage topical version of the app or read it on the neg arguments, is to describe the set of debates that happen after that and say that those debates are good or better than the debates that happen under their model. There is a third argument about this, that about compatibility, that I really like, which is the argument that what topicality says is that topicality says that here is what the affirmative needs to do to meet its burden of proof. So in order for the affirmative to win the debate, they need to prove that there is an example of they need to prove the resolutional statement true inductively by providing an example of the resolutional statement. And so topicality just says, here is what the affirmative needs to do to win. Topicality does not tell future affirmative teams what they have to do. The affirmative team can do literally anything it wants to and lose. That's fine, right? You're allowed to talk about whatever you want, but if you would like to win the debate, if you would like to meet your win condition, here is what that means. So topicality is fundamentally an argument about the burden of proof and about the expectations for what should meet negative rejoinder, rather than an argument about here is what you must, here is what you have to do. Yeah.
For read it and lose, is this an argument that should be made in the 2MC, or should it be like integrated to the 1MC interp text?
I think you should make it in the 2NC. I think you should make that argument in the 2NC when you're, I would always put these compatibility arguments together to answer whatever their exclusion DA was. So they would make their, exclusion, you bracket it out, our discussion DA, I would say no, one, subpoint 1, topical version of the app, subpoint 2, read it on the neg, subpoint 3, read it and lose. So that's where I would do it. I don't think you need to put it in the 1NC.
Okay, so you wouldn't have an intertext that says neg not be burdened with rejoinder against untopical affirmatives. You think it's better to keep that argument for the 2MC?
Well, I think that these are the same. Well, but part of it is when you say our interpretation is the affirmative should defend the instrumental implementation of the United States federal government exploring and or developing the Arctic, translating that, what are you saying? The negative ought not be burdened with rejoinder against affirmatives that do not do that, right? So it's I think that those sentences are communicating the exact same idea. So it's fine to say that in the 1NC, but you don't have to. You're communicating the same thing always, is the way that I think about that. One other 2NR thing that I want to discuss, particularly about the impact stuff, is oftentimes there is a bit of a choice between, do we go for clash in the 2NR, or do we go for arguments about fairness in the 2NR? And so I think that this, at its core, is a judge adaptation question. And so it is really important, if you have a big team, even if you have a small team, do what you can to find out information about the judges that you are commonly getting in topicality debates to figure out what impacts they like to hear in the 2NR. One of my coaches used to always tell me that framework is like frozen yogurt. Everybody they got different toppings they want to put on it. Everybody wants it a little bit differently. And so knowing the way different judges want to hear different arguments explained is critically important to increasing and enhancing your win rate on this stuff. So know what judges want you to go for fairness, know what judges want you to go for clash, and understand that there are circumstances where you can and should go for both. It's all concrete, all based on what has happened in the debate. Questions?
what would be the scenario in which you want to go for both impacts in the 2 1 hour?
So the most common scenario that I came upon this is when you're debating in front of panels. So like, let's say you have an Elam debate, you have 3 judges on that panel, one judge really wants you to go for fairness arguments, one judge really doesn't think fairness is an impact and wants you to go for clash, and then there's a 3rd judge that's kind of in between those. What do? Well, in that circumstance, I thought that it was probably the most competitively valuable thing to do was to make a sort of short fairness extension at the top of the 2 1 to then go deep on our clash arguments and to operate a little bit in both worlds. So I give the judge that wants to hear fairness debate as a game, I give them that argument, and then I also give the set of clash arguments for other judges. All right, a few common affirmative arguments or affirmative objections that I want to talk about. So one, and this has been, something we've talked a lot in our lab about, is the affirmative will usually say something about the things that we debate about matters for who we become as subjects. So they will say that in order for us to be, we should, in order to maximize our ability to be ethical advocates, right, we should debate about ethical things, we should debate about things that are really important, and that this is important for producing ethical decision making, right? So debate shapes our subjectivity. The set of contents that we debate about is really important for the subject that is produced after debate. And they will sometimes use this to try to impact turn these clash arguments. They'll say, well, yeah, you produce great advocates, but are those advocates ethical? Are they good subjects? And oftentimes, I will see negative teams say, very forcefully that debate does not shape their subjectivity, that there are a lot of other things that shape them as subjects, who their friends are, who their family is, who they go to school, what they learn outside of debate. I will say that from a capital T truth perspective, from my position, I find it difficult to say with a straight face that debate does not shape subjectivity. I do debate professionally. It profoundly shaped my life and continues to, right? And so debate certainly shapes me as a subject. However, that being said, I think that the most persuasive negative frame here is not to say debates cannot possibly shape our subjectivity, but it's to say that the content that we talk about in any one individual debate is not what is shaping us as a subject or creating our ethical frame for the world. What does shape our subject is this iterative process of clash and argumentative refinement. Having in-depth debates about the policy questions that are brought upon by the resolution, researching those questions, having hours and hour-long conversations with really, really smart debaters about these policy questions. That is what shapes us as subjects. So it is the process of clash that creates a subject, is not the content of any individual debate. Yeah.
What about it's like an extension of this, that having clash over the state and state policies forces us to become addicted to the state or reliant on the state in a way that's bad?
Yeah, so great question. So the question on the floor is, how do we answer the affirmative argument that constantly talking about the state, having clash about what the state should do, advocating for what the state should do, that this makes us either addicted to or dependent on the state and state action, makes us only think in frames where we think about how the state should operate? Well, one, I think the argument that I always like here is that the affirmative team is always saying that the state should change its behavior. Okay, so rather than endorsing the state as is, policy debate asks us, how should the government change its policies, its laws, and the way that it operates to respond to the problem areas brought upon by the resolution. So what debate asks us to do, rather than endorse the state and think about why everything that the government does is great, it asks us to think very critically about how the government can change and about how there are flaws in the way that the government currently exists and currently operates. So I think that the incentive structure for the affirmatives to think about how the government can change, I think, is my number one answer to that. Number two is just like the sort of getting at the more that we research about the government, research about the state, the more information and the better able we would be to critique the government and to think about its flaws. So it's like, we are smart enough to come up with our conclusions about what ought to happen or about whether the government is good or bad on our own, but the process of learning about those things is really important to coming to those conclusions. Yeah.
Is it possible for the 2-hour to win the framework debate if the affirmative is ahead on like policymaking / Fiat bad, or no?
I think that, you know, in practice, it would be very difficult to win the debate if the affirmative was winning simply that policy making or the government acting in any instance is bad. But again, there are some frames for answering that argument that I think are useful. So one, that, you know, this frame that the affirmative is always changing the way that the state is behaving. Two, we are having in-depth conversations about state behavior, which is really useful. Three, we are putting the affirmative that says there are some politically pragmatic ways that the state can create reform and create change. We're putting that in conversation with negative teams that can make arguments that we should abolish the state, we should move away from the state. So it's like, if the conclusion that the judge draws at the end of the debate is that the state is bad or something like that, then that just means that there's a really great negative critique of the state under our model of debate. So it's a conversation to be had and a conversation that we ought to have, rather than a premise that we know for 100% sure is concluded, right? So it's that those sets of arguments are negative arguments.
Can you quickly repeat that part again?
Yeah, absolutely. So if the conclusion that the judge draws at the end of the debate is that the state is a bad actor, okay, then that means under our model of debate, there is a really good negative critique of state action that can answer affirmative policy actions that change state behavior. So our model better accesses a conversation about critique of state versus change state behavior, change state policy. Like that's a conversation we have under our model. The conversation that they have under their model is, well, we already know the government is bad in all instances. We don't even have to talk about that. We should just talk about how to revolt against it, right? Like we have a much more nuanced conversation about it under our model. Okay, one other affirmative frame that I hear sometimes is, you know, creative counter-interpretations for how their model operates. So sometimes I will hear one, sort of what the neg-neg model, right? That the affirmative should argue against the topic, the negative should defend a counter method or a counter model of that topic. Again, as I mentioned earlier, those debates I think are bad because the affirmative has the permutation, which means one, that those debates are unfair, the affirmative wins all of them. Two, I think it undermines the clash and research incentives that occur under those debates. The second frame that I hear commonly is the affirmative will say, we have provided an answer to the resolutional question, we've said no, right? We are neg, and so your response to that can be to say, yes, the United States federal government should develop or explore the Arctic. So like we have answered the resolutional question in the neg, like we will be neg on the AF, you can be AF on the neg, basically. This argument, one, it's not predictable. Two, the way that permutations operate changes things pretty fundamentally. So it does not make a lot of sense for the affirmative to have the side that says we should not do something. You know, the affirmative should be the side of change, because that's the basis of debate and the basis of the burden of proof.
Can you quickly repeat the first interp? First half interp?
Neg. So the first one I was talking about was the affirmative will say, you know, they will have a negative response to the resolutional question and some strategy in of themselves, and the negative team can then have a counter method or a counter strategy against this. There's some cards, you know, that have posited this idea. Yeah.
Okay, two things.
Yeah.
One is, what did you mean by, like, the permutation changes the way, like, are you saying that means that the negative would be able to permute and that's bad, or that the AF would then be able to perm the neg?
The AF that has taken the role of the neg now gets to make permutation arguments about policies proposed by the neg, right?
Okay.
And because the basis for competition is that the affirmative fulfills its burden of proof, right? That the affirmative defends the side of change, defends why that action of change is good, and then the negative can present an opportunity cost to that change. There's no frame for competition if the affirmative has not done that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And one more thing, what about the interp that's like, all the topical AF plus RF?
Yep. Yeah. So counter-interpretation, only RF. How do we answer this? You just say this is so clearly self-serving that it is, you know, it's not at all predictable, because predictability is about the words of the resolution. It's self-serving. It justifies literally every other team saying counter-interpretation, topical AFs plus RF. And so it creates a slippery slope of literally everyone doing that, and we create a situation where no one is top. Yeah.
How do you approach responding to counter-interps? They're like pretty different most of the time, but they're mostly along the lines of like evaluate the ethicality of debate prior to like talking about the resolution, or like analyze XYZ things about debate prior to resolution, because it's like a prior question, like those types of interpretations.
Yeah, so the question on the floor is, how do we respond to interpretations of the counter-interpretations that affirmative teams proffer that say, we need to analyze the ethicality of debate before considering the topic, or, you know, we need to analyze these prior questions before considering the topic. So the way that you handle any of these interpretations is to think about, well, what would this mean from a limits perspective, right? What are all the different lenses through which one might analyze the ethicality of debate? What are all the different areas of the library that one might go to find critiques about the ethicality of debate, right? And so when you're saying that they explode limits, right, or that their interpretation is much less limited, you need to talk concretely about what their interpretation allows into debate and what different literature bases would be covered by that. So it's like, okay, we need to answer this prior question. It's like, well, where would the negative team then go to prepare their answers to those questions? Like, would this be a good limited boundaries for debate? It certainly wouldn't be a predictable one, right? Because, you know, predictability is grounded in the words of the resolution. So how do we know that this is the model of debates that we ought to be thinking about before the tournament? And then how do we prepare for it from a limits perspective, right? From all the different literature bases that might be involved in that question, right? From a practical matter, and we're all going through this experience a little bit, like it's hard to create a case neg to a critical affirmative. It's a pretty difficult task, right? And so the more and more and more critical affirmatives that are encompassed, or critical literature bases that are encompassed by their interpretation, it becomes very, very hard for the negative to come up with specific strategies against all those different affirmatives. And so it just, as it continues to go, it continues to make those debates a little bit thinner, and certainly less fair for the neg. All right, 12 o'clock. I will release you on lunch.